It was the kind of rain that never stopped, the kind that soaked through clothes, through skin, straight into the bones. I'd been driving for hours, maybe longer. The roads had been empty for miles. I hadn't seen another pair of headlights since I passed a gas station 2 hours back, and even that had felt like a ghost town. Just one bored-looking cashier staring at the security monitors while rain pounded against the windows. I was heading to a job site. It was supposed to be a quick inspection of some remote property, one of those contracts I picked up now and then to make extra cash. Some land developer had bought an old cabin and wanted to know if it was worth fixing or if it was better to tear down. I wasn't a contractor, not officially, but I knew enough about structures to give them a basic report. I'd done a few jobs like this before. They usually sent me out to places no one wanted to bother with, abandoned spots, forgotten land, places where the only sound at night was the wind pushing through the trees. The rain made the road almost invisible. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and my wipers couldn't keep up with the water slamming against the windshield. Every so often, I hit a dip in the road, and the truck would shudder, tires skimming over unseen puddles before gripping the dirt again. My GPS told me I had another 30 minutes to go. I should have been there already, but the rain had slowed everything down. I didn't mind the drive, but I hated being on roads like this at night, especially when the weather was bad. There was something about the way the darkness stretched out on either side, how the trees looked taller, their branches twisting in strange shapes when the lightning flashed. Finally, I saw the turnoff. It was a narrow dirt path, barely visible, nearly washed out from the rain. I almost missed it. My tires slid as I turned, mud pulling at them, but I kept steady. The road was worse than I expected. Deep grooves cut through the mud where water had carved paths down the slope. My truck wasn't made for this kind of terrain, but I didn't have much choice. I wasn't about to leave it behind and walk the rest of the way. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The rain blurred everything. Even with my high beams, I could barely see past a few feet. The trees pressed in close, branches scraping against the truck, leaves heavy with water. I checked my GPS again. The cabin was close now, less than a mile ahead. But something felt off. It was just a feeling, a weight in my chest. Maybe it was the way the road twisted, or the fact that I hadn't seen any signs of life. No fences, no mailboxes, not even an old sign nailed to a post. And then I saw it. The cabin was just ahead, barely visible through the trees. It looked worse than I expected. Half hidden behind overgrown brush, its roof sagging in places. The porch looked like it might give out under the weight of a single step. I pulled up and cut the engine. The rain didn't stop. It only got louder now that the truck wasn't running. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the door, and stepped into the downpour. Water splashed up my legs, mud grabbing at my boots. I shined the light at the cabin. The windows were boarded up, but the wood was rotting. The front door hung slightly open. Not much, just enough to notice. That wasn't right. This place had been abandoned for years, according to the files. No one had lived here, no one had been out here in a long time. But the door, it wasn't just broken, it was open. I stepped closer. The porch creaked under my weight. I pushed the door fully open with the end of my flashlight. Inside, the air smelled damp, thick with rot. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor warped from years of moisture. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in dust. But there were footprints, faint, barely visible, but there. Not mine. I felt my stomach tighten. The rain outside made it hard to hear anything, but I stood still, listening. The whole cabin felt wrong. I took a step inside. The wood groaned beneath me. I shined my flashlight around. There wasn't much. An old fireplace, a few broken chairs, empty shelves. Then I noticed something else. The footprints weren't just near the door. They led deeper inside, toward the hallway. I didn't want to follow them. Every part of me told me to turn around, get back in the truck, and leave. But I had a job to do. I stepped forward. The hallway was darker, the smell worse. There were 2 doors, both slightly open. I pushed the first one open all the way. A bedroom. The bed was missing its mattress, the frame leaning to one side. The window was boarded up like the others. Nothing here. The second door. I hesitated. The footprints led here. I nudged the door open with my boot. The flashlight beam cut through the dark. The room was empty. First, then I saw it. In the far corner, a pile of blankets. No, not blankets. A sleeping bag. Someone had been here recently, and then I heard it. Not inside the cabin. Outside. Footsteps. Not mine. Not an animal. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned off the flashlight, standing in complete darkness. I listened. The rain made it hard to tell how close the footsteps were, but they were there. I moved back, careful not to make a sound. A shadow passed by the window. Someone was out there. I reached for the flashlight, ready to turn it back on if I had to, but I didn't move. Then I heard something worse. The footsteps weren't just outside. They were moving toward the porch. I didn't breathe. The boards creaked. Someone was stepping onto the porch. I moved fast. I flicked the flashlight back on, bolted for the front door, and ran. The rain hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I jumped off the porch, hitting the mud hard. My boots slid, but I caught myself. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see who or what had been standing there. I yanked the truck door open, climbed in, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine groaned, didn't start. I turned the key again. Nothing. My breath was coming fast now. I looked up. The cabin door was still open, and in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the porch, I saw movement. A figure, not running, just standing, watching. The truck roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw it into reverse, tires skidding, mud spraying. I turned the wheel too hard, nearly sent myself into the trees, but I kept going. I didn't stop, not for miles. I didn't check the mirrors, didn't look back, just drove. When I finally reached the highway, my hands were still shaking. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the lights, and just sat there, rain hammering against the roof. I never sent the report. I never told them what I saw. The cabin was abandoned, but someone was living there, and they didn't want to be found. I had been on the force for just over a decade, and I thought I had seen just about everything. Drunk drivers, domestic fights, break-ins, missing persons, bodies found where they shouldn't be. But nothing really prepared me for what happened that night. Started as a routine call like they always do. The dispatcher radioed in, saying someone had reported a vehicle abandoned on a dirt road about 20 miles outside of town. No license plates, no signs of the driver, just sitting there with its doors locked. The way she described it, I figured it was probably stolen and dumped, maybe some kids joyriding. The sun had already gone down, and the air had that cold bite that comes out when the seasons are about to change. I took the county highway out of town, then turned onto the dirt road. The land out there was flat, open fields with patches of trees breaking up the horizon. No houses, no farms, just empty land. After about 10 minutes of driving, I spotted the car on the side of the road, sitting under the light of a single street lamp that seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. It was an old blue sedan, clean but worn. I pulled over behind it, turned on my spotlight, and radioed in to say I was on the scene. I got out of my cruiser, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air smelled like damp dirt and dry grass. I walked up to the car and shined my light through the driver's side window. The inside was spotless. No trash, No personal belongings, just an empty front seat and a back seat covered by a thin layer of dust. I tried the handle. Locked. I circled around to the passenger side. Locked. The trunk? Locked. I leaned down and checked the tires. They were in good shape, no signs of damage. The car didn't look like it had been in an accident, either. It was just there. Something about it felt off. I went back to my cruiser and radioed in for a plate check, but as soon as I gave dispatch the details, she told me the plates were missing. I already knew that, but I was hoping maybe there had been a registration sticker or something I had missed. There wasn't. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop. A call had come in earlier that day from a woman saying she had seen a man walking along that same stretch of road, heading toward where I was now. She said he wasn't carrying anything, wasn't hitchhiking, just walking. I looked around. The fields were wide and open, but the tree lines on both sides of the road were thick, dark. If someone had been walking out here and left this car, they could have gone into the trees, or they could have kept walking down the road. But where? There was nothing out here. I turned on my flashlight and walked a little farther down the road, scanning the ground for footprints or anything else. The dirt was dry, packed down from years of vehicles going through, but I could see faint impressions where someone had walked off to the right, toward the tree line. I followed them. The grass crunched under my boots as I stepped off the road. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating branches and dry leaves. The tracks led deeper into the trees, not just a few steps in, but far enough that I had to slow down to keep from making too much noise. Then I saw something. A shoe. It was lying on its side near the base of a tree. A man's running shoe, white with a black stripe. I walked closer and crouched down. It wasn't torn or damaged, just dirty, like it had been out here for a while. But there was only one. I kept my light pointed at the ground, scanning for more footprints. The trail continued past the shoe, deeper into the trees. I went on. My pulse was steady, but my grip tightened on the flashlight. The air in the trees felt heavier, like something was pressing down on it. I moved slowly, trying to listen for anything out of place. Twigs snapping, movement, breathing. Then I saw another shoe, the match to the first one. This one was a little farther up, near the edge of a small clearing. And next to it, there was something else. A shirt. It was spread out flat on the ground, like someone had taken it off and laid it there on purpose. I stopped. The hairs on my arms stood up. This wasn't right. I raised my flashlight and scanned the clearing. Nothing. No movement.
No sounds.
But I knew someone had been here. I turned back toward the road, moving faster now. My boots felt heavier, my breath coming out in short, controlled bursts. I was trained for a lot of things, but walking alone into the woods at night, following a trail of discarded clothes, wasn't one of them. I made it back to my cruiser and radioed in, telling dispatch I needed backup. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I snapped my head toward the trees, my hand going to my holster. There was nothing there, but I knew I had seen something. I waited, my breath slow and steady. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it again. A shadow, slipping between the trees, moving fast. I drew my gun. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, all at once, the shadow disappeared. Silence. I stood there, my heart hammering, my grip steady. I listened. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like forever until finally headlights appeared in the distance. Backup. When they arrived, I briefed them and we searched the area. We found nothing. No footprints, no more clothes, no man. The sedan was towed and we ran every possible check on it. Nothing. No reports of it being stolen, no registered owner. Just an empty car in the middle of nowhere. I didn't sleep that night. For weeks, I kept thinking about the man who had been walking down that road. The one the woman had called about. Where did he go? And more importantly, Who had been watching me from the trees? Losing her took more from me than I ever thought possible. It wasn't just the emptiness in my house, the deafening silence where laughter used to be. It was the loss of purpose, the way the days stretched on like a road without end, with nothing but memories to keep me company. I had always loved driving. Before, it was something we did together, long stretches of highway, music low, the world passing by as we talked about nothing and everything. But now it was different. The road felt empty. I drove because sitting still was unbearable. So that's how I ended up where I did, out in the middle of nowhere. It started as a simple trip, an attempt to outrun my thoughts. I packed a few things into my truck, some clothes, a sleeping bag, a tent, a knife, some food, water, and a few supplies. Nothing crazy. I wasn't planning anything more than just being gone for a while. No real destination, just away. I don't even remember which roads I took. I drove for hours, maybe days, the gas station stops and stretches of road blurring together. Towns got smaller, houses farther apart, until eventually there was nothing but wilderness. Trees lined the road like silent watchers, the sky above shifting from dull gray to the deep, unbroken black of night. I pulled over when the exhaustion became too much. A small clearing on the side of the road, a dirt path leading off into the woods. No signs, no fences, just emptiness. I killed the engine and sat for a while, listening to the silence pressing in. No streetlights, no distant hum of civilization, just wind in the trees. I should have turned back. Instead, I got out, stretched my legs, and decided to set up camp. The night was cold, the air damp with the smell of pine and earth. I found a decent spot not too far from the truck, cleared some ground, and set up my tent. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so. I had camped enough times in my life to know how the woods should sound at night. Crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of some animal. But this, it was like everything was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination. Grief had a way of messing with the mind, twisting the ordinary into something else. I started a small fire, ate a little, and sat there, staring into the flames. The silence stretched on, pressing in from all sides. And then I heard it, a sound, faint, distant. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft rustling, barely audible. But then it came again, steady, deliberate. Footsteps, not an animal, not something darting through the underbrush. These were slow, measured steps. I turned my head toward the darkness, straining my ears. Nothing. For a long time, I sat there, waiting. My knife was in my pack, still zipped up. Stupid. I should have had it closer. The fire crackled, throwing shifting shadows against the trees. I told myself it was just the woods settling the way they always do, but I wasn't convinced. Eventually, the exhaustion won. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and shut my eyes. But I didn't sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. Something was wrong. It wasn't a sound that woke me this time. It was the feeling, that gut-deep, instinctual sense that something isn't right. I lay there, holding my breath. Then movement. Not close, but not far either. A crunch of leaves, a shift in the underbrush. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tight. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, circling. Not a bear, not a coyote. Animals don't move like that. I waited, every muscle tense, listening. The sound would stop for long stretches, then pick up again in a different spot. Like whoever or whatever it was watching. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I don't know how long I stayed like that, knife in hand, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, expecting at any moment to see a shadow pass by. But nothing happened. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The woods went silent again. I lay there until dawn. The morning light felt like salvation. I unzipped the tent slowly, cautiously, and stepped out. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. Just my truck, my tent, and the endless trees. I packed up fast. I was rattled, but I told myself it was nothing. Sleep deprivation, grief, my mind playing tricks on me. I had driven too far, camped in a place too remote, and now I was jumping at shadows. So, I got back in my truck and drove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I drove for hours. The road twisted through endless trees, the same landscape repeating over and over like I was stuck in some loop. No signs, no mile markers, just road. And then I saw it, a truck. Not just any truck, my truck, parked on the side of the road in the exact same clearing. My campsite. I slammed the brakes so hard the tires skidded. This wasn't possible. I had been driving straight. I hadn't turned around. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my heart pounding. Then something moved in the trees, a shape just at the edge of my vision. Watching, I didn't think. I hit the gas. The truck roared forward, tires kicking up gravel. I sped past the clearing, past the trees, past whatever was standing there. I didn't look. I drove fast, faster than was safe, ignoring the twisting curves, the uneven road. My hands were slick on the wheel, my mind racing. I don't know how long I drove. Hours? Days? Time lost meaning. But eventually, the trees thinned, the road straightened, and I saw something ahead. A gas station. Civilization. I pulled in fast, the truck shuddering as I slammed it into park. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, my chest heaving. Eventually, I got out. The station was old, faded, the kind of place that looked abandoned even when it wasn't. A single pump, a small store, a flickering light above the entrance. I went inside, bought a coffee with shaking hands, and asked the guy at the counter where I was. He told me I was about 50 miles from where I thought I had started. I hadn't been driving in circles. I hadn't gone back. But somehow I had seen my own truck, my own campsite, exactly as I left it. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I never went back, never drove that road again. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I think about that sound. Those slow, deliberate footsteps in the dark. And I wonder if they ever really stopped. I never should have taken that road. It was late October, a cold wind rolling in as I drove through the back roads of Wyoming, cutting through stretches of land that felt untouched by time. I had been on the road for hours, tired and stiff, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. I was heading home from a job in Montana, hauling some old equipment in the bed of my truck. The route I had planned was supposed to take me through a few small towns, enough places to stop and rest if I needed. But I had gotten impatient, wanting to shave off an hour or two, and took a narrow road cutting through the plains. It wasn't even on my GPS. I told myself I'd be fine. I had plenty of gas, and the truck was in good shape. But within an hour, I knew I had made a mistake. The road was worse than I thought. At first, it was just cracked pavement worn down by years of neglect. Then it turned to gravel and then dirt. The deeper I went, the less it felt like a road at all, more like a path that had been forgotten. The sky had turned gray, a storm building on the horizon. The air smelled like rain. I kept driving. I told myself that I'd eventually hit another road, maybe even loop back to the main highway. But I didn't. The land stretched empty in all directions. Nothing but rolling hills and clusters of dead trees. No houses, no signs, no people. Then the truck started acting up. At first, it was subtle, just a slight hesitation when I pressed the gas. Then a sputter, a jerking motion. My stomach dropped as the engine light flickered on. I pulled over and shut the truck off. The wind had picked up, rattling the trees in the distance. I tried to start it again. Nothing. I tried again. The engine cranked but wouldn't turn over. I checked my phone. No service. I already knew that, but seeing the no signal message made it worse. I stepped out of the truck, the cold hitting me instantly. The land was dead silent, except for the wind. I popped the hood, pretending I knew what I was doing. I wasn't a mechanic. I knew enough to check the basics: battery, belts, hoses, but everything looked fine. I was stranded. I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors out of instinct. I wasn't sure what to do. I had enough supplies to last the night, some water, a couple of protein bars, but that was it. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest town. Then I saw it. Far off in the distance, beyond a stretch of trees, there was something. A shape, barely visible through the haze of the coming storm. A structure of some kind. A house? A barn? I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. The sun was already starting to set, and if I was going to find help, I needed to move now. The walk felt longer than it should have. The ground was uneven, patches of dry grass crunching under my boots. The wind howled through the trees, making it feel like something was moving just out of sight. I kept glancing back at my truck, the only real sign of safety. Then I reached it. It was a cabin, an old one. The wood was dark, almost black with age. The roof sagged in the middle. The door was closed, but the windows were empty. No glass, just dark, gaping holes. It looked abandoned. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but I had no choice. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under my weight. I knocked on the door just in case. No answer. Pushed it open. Inside it was dark. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. My flashlight beam swept across the room. An old table, a few broken chairs, a fireplace filled with ash. No signs of life. I stepped inside, my boots echoing against the floor. There was another room in the back, a doorway leading to what looked like a bedroom. I hesitated before stepping through. The bed was still there. The sheets were pulled back, the mattress stained and sagging. A dresser sat against the wall, its drawers open, empty. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. The prints led from the bed to the doorway, and then stopped. I spun around, my flashlight shaking. The cabin was empty. I was sure of it, but someone had been here. Recently, the wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the walls. I took a step back, my pulse pounding. I needed to leave. Now, I turned off my flashlight and backed toward the door. Then outside something moved. A shape, a shadow. I dropped to the floor, pressing myself against the wall. My heart hammered in my chest. I listened. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon, forcing myself to breathe silently. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the door. I stayed still. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. Then the doorknob moved. Not fast, not aggressive, just testing. I clenched my teeth, waiting. Then silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. The wind rattled the cabin, the darkness pressing in around me. I didn't dare move. Then finally I heard them. Footsteps, moving away. Slow at first, then faster, then gone. I waited until I was sure, until the wind was the only sound left. Then I ran. I didn't stop. I tore through the trees, my breath burning in my chest. When I saw my truck, I nearly collapsed with relief. I climbed inside and locked the doors. I tried the ignition. The truck roared to life. I didn't question it. I threw it in reverse, spinning the tires on the dirt. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove until I found a road, until I saw lights. I never took that route again. And I never told anyone what happened. Because some things don't need explaining. Some things are just warnings. And I listened. We had been flown in under the cover of darkness. No lights, no noise, just the deep hum of the chopper's rotors slicing through the air above a barren landscape. It was one of those places where even the trees seemed to whisper, where the land stretched out endlessly, untouched and unwelcoming. The coordinates put us somewhere in the deep interior of an unnamed country, a place that never made the news, never made it onto any map that mattered. Just land, harsh and empty, the kind of place that had swallowed men before and would do so again. Our mission was classified. That much was clear. We weren't told names, only objectives. There was a compound, buried deep within a valley that rarely saw daylight. Satellite images showed activity, vehicles coming and going, something being moved in and out. Intel suggested it wasn't weapons, but something else. Something bigger. Something important enough to get men like us deployed into the middle of nowhere with no support, no fallback, no backup. We hit the ground running, the chopper lifting away behind us like a ghost vanishing into the night. The air was cold, dry, the kind that scratched at the throat and made every breath feel like it was taking something from you. I adjusted the strap of my pack, shifting my rifle into a more comfortable position. There were 6 of us, all moving in silence, our boots pressing into the earth without a sound. The first few hours were uneventful. Just terrain, nothing but dead trees, rocky inclines, and an open sky that felt too big, too empty. It was a strange feeling, knowing that there wasn't a soul for miles, and yet feeling like you were being watched. We reached the first checkpoint before dawn, setting up a small observation post overlooking the valley below. Through the scope, the compound looked quiet, just a few low buildings, a handful of vehicles, and a dirt road leading off into the unknown. But we knew better. Places like this never looked dangerous until they were. Hours passed. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the land. The compound came to life. Men moving in and out, loading crates into trucks, checking perimeter defenses. They were organized, not just some backwater militia running weapons out of an abandoned building. These men had structure, training. That changed things. We waited, watching patterns, counting heads, taking notes. Then, just before sunset, movement. A convoy approaching from the east, 3 trucks, a pair of armed guards riding in the back. Something was being transported. We couldn't see what, not from this distance, but whatever it was, they were taking no chances. That was our cue. We moved under the cover of darkness, descending the ridge and crossing the open ground in calculated bursts, using the terrain to our advantage. The plan was simple: cut the power, breach the perimeter, secure whatever was being transported, and get out before anyone knew we were there. Things never go to plan. We reached the perimeter fence, cutting through without a sound. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of oil and earth. A single guard patrolled nearby, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his posture lazy. He didn't hear us coming. We moved in, sticking to the shadows, navigating between storage buildings and parked trucks. The main structure loomed ahead, a squat concrete bunker with reinforced doors. That was our target. We split into 2 teams. I took the rear entrance with 2 others while the rest secured the front. The door was locked, but locks don't mean much when you have the right tools. Within seconds, we were inside, moving through dimly lit corridors that smelled of damp concrete and old metal. Then we heard it. Not footsteps, not voices, something else. A low, mechanical hum like a generator but deeper, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through our bones. We pressed forward, weapons at the ready, senses heightened. The air felt heavier, the temperature dropping the deeper we went. Then we found it, a room larger than we expected, filled with crates, machinery, equipment we didn't recognize. And in the center, something covered in tarps, cables running to and from it, pulsating with energy. I moved closer, gripping the edge of the tarp, pulling it back just enough to see what was underneath. I wish I hadn't. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't technology. It was biological, something alive, something restrained, breathing slow and heavy, its form obscured by restraints and machinery. And then the alarms went off, a sound that cut through the air like a blade, followed by the unmistakable echo of boots on concrete. They knew we were here. We had minutes, maybe seconds. The first shots rang out near the entrance, a burst of automatic fire followed by shouts in a language I didn't recognize. We moved fast, knocking over crates, pulling down shelves to create cover. The firefight was intense, brutal, close quarters. Muzzle flashes lit up the room in bursts of orange and yellow. One of ours went down, a single shot to the neck, blood pooling before he even hit the ground. No time to process it. No time to mourn. We fought our way out, pushing back through the corridors, dodging incoming fire, throwing grenades to cover our retreat. The compound was alive now, men pouring out of buildings, headlights cutting through the darkness as trucks roared to life. We made it to the perimeter fence, ducking behind a storage container as bullets tore through the night. The extraction point was a mile out, a grueling sprint through open ground with hostiles at our backs. I don't know how we made it. By the time we reached the rendezvous, the chopper was already inbound, its spotlight cutting through the dark like a beacon. We piled in, breathless, bloodied, leaving behind a burning compound and a trail of bodies. As we lifted away, I caught one last glimpse of the valley below, smoke rising, figures moving in the chaos. We hadn't completed the mission. We hadn't secured the target, but we had seen something we were never meant to see, and that was enough. Back at base, there were no debriefs, no reports, just silence. Our fallen were never mentioned again. The mission didn't exist, and neither did whatever was under that tarp. I worked for a construction company back in 2013, mostly doing contract jobs that took me all over the country. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, so I didn't mind moving around. It was just me and the work, which I liked well enough. It paid decent, and I got to be outside most of the time, which was better than being stuck in some office. That year, we had a big contract in northern Montana, way out past the little towns that dot the highways. It was a private job, some rich guy's hunting lodge. My boss, Dan, was the one who landed the deal, and he needed a few of us to help build the place from the ground up. It was a 6-hour drive from the nearest city, and the last stretch was on a dirt road that barely qualified as a road. Dan was the kind of boss who was always watching, always making sure nobody was slacking. He wasn't outright mean, but he had this way of making you feel like you weren't doing enough, even if you were working your ass off. It was like he got a kick out of making people feel uneasy. The job was supposed to take about 6 weeks, maybe a little longer if the weather got bad. We stayed in these little prefab cabins the client had brought in for us, just simple plywood things with enough room for a cot, a table, and not much else. The work itself was hard, but I was used to that. It was the setting that made it different. It was quiet out there, too quiet. No traffic, no people, just miles of dense forest stretching in every direction. The only sound at night was the wind moving through the trees and, sometimes, the distant howls of coyotes. During the day, it wasn't much better. Even with the crew working, the place had this stillness to it, like something was watching from just beyond the trees. At first, I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. We were out there with no cell service, no way to contact anyone outside the crew unless we drove the 6 hours back into town. It made everything feel cut off, like we were in a different world. Dan didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, he liked it. He was always wandering off on his own, going into the woods and coming back without saying where he'd been. I figured maybe he was scouting for materials or checking the perimeter, but it started to seem like he was just disappearing. I tried not to think too much about it. We had work to do, and that was my main focus. But then things started happening. It was small stuff at first. Tools going missing, materials not being where we left them. We figured it was just forgetfulness or maybe someone moving things around and not putting them back. But then, one morning, we found deep footprints in the dirt around the cabins. They weren't ours. Dan brushed it off, said it was probably just an animal. But I've seen animal tracks before. These were human, barefoot. Someone had been walking around our cabins while we slept. That's when things really started to feel off. One night, I woke up to the sound of something outside my cabin. It was slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I stayed still, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I waited a few minutes before I forced myself to peek out the window. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. That heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched. The next morning, I told the crew. I expected someone else to have heard it, but no one had. They just shrugged it off. Even Dan, who usually overanalyzed everything, didn't seem to care. I started paying closer attention to him after that. The way he'd go missing for hours at a time, always coming back with this blank, unreadable expression. The way he'd stare off into the trees, like he was expecting something. One evening, I decided to follow him. I waited until he did his usual disappearing act. Then I trailed behind, keeping my distance. He moved deeper into the woods, past the edge of where we normally worked. He didn't have a flashlight, didn't even seem to need one. He just walked, like he knew exactly where he was going. I followed for maybe 15 minutes before he finally stopped. There was a clearing ahead, and in the fading light, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Pit. It was about 6 feet wide, deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom. And surrounding it were bones. Not animal bones, human ones. I wanted to turn back, pretend I hadn't seen it. But then Dan did something that made my blood run cold. He knelt down beside the pit and whispered something. I couldn't hear what he said, but whatever it wasn't right. The way he was speaking, slow and deliberate, like he was having a conversation with something that wasn't there. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. Then, without warning, Dan stopped talking. He turned his head slightly, just enough that I could tell he knew I was there. I didn't wait. I ran. I tore through the trees, branches slashing at my arms, my breath ragged in my throat. I expected to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. Just silence. By the time I reached the cabins, I was shaking so bad I could barely get my door open. I locked it, sat on the cot, and forced myself to breathe. The next morning, Dan acted like nothing had happened. But he watched me. I could feel his eyes on me all day. I knew then that I had to leave. That night, I packed my bag, waited until the rest of the crew was asleep, and started walking. I didn't care that I had a 6-hour trek ahead of me. I just needed to get out. I was about 3 miles down the road when I heard an engine behind me. Headlights flooded the path, and I turned to see Dan's truck rolling up slow. Too slow. I didn't run. I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I stepped aside, making it look like I was just stretching my legs. Dan pulled up beside me, rolled down the window. He didn't say anything, just stared. I nodded, forced a smile, and said I just needed some air. He stared for a second longer, then nodded back, and drove away. I don't know why he let me go. Maybe he figured I wouldn't say anything. Maybe he knew no one would believe me. I don't care. I just kept walking. By the time I made it to town, the sun was coming up. I got the first bus out and never looked back. A few weeks later, I heard the job had wrapped up early. No explanation, just done. I never saw Dan again after that. I don't know what he was doing out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I was lucky to get out, and that some places are meant to stay empty. It was a long stretch of road, nothing but open land and scattered trees on either side. The kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. The kind of place where if something happened to you, no one would hear you scream. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, heading home from a job in a town I had never been to before. It was a late afternoon in autumn, the kind where the sun looked like it was slipping down the sky faster than usual. I knew I had about 2 hours before darkness completely took over. The road was cracked and faded. No streetlights, barely any signs, just miles of emptiness. My gas gauge was dipping lower than I liked, but I figured I had enough to get to the next town. I hadn't seen another car in at least an hour. It was the kind of quiet that started to make me feel uneasy, like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. That's when I saw it. A truck, parked on the side of the road up ahead. It was an old, rusted-out thing. Looked like it had been there for years. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A man was standing next to it, waving his arms. His clothes were dirty, torn in some places. His hair was messy, like he had been out here for a while. He was looking right at me, desperate. I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't want to stop. Everything in my gut told me to keep driving. But then I saw the blood. His shirt was stained with it, dark patches running down the front. His hands were shaking. He looked like he was in bad shape. I slowed down just a little. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The second I did, the man lurched toward my car. That's when I knew something was wrong. I slammed my foot down on the gas, my tires screeching against the pavement. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man stumble forward, arms outstretched, but I was already too far ahead. My breathing was heavy, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. Something was seriously wrong. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again, but the fear in my gut didn't go away. I kept driving, heart pounding, eyes darting to my mirrors every few seconds. After about 15 minutes, I finally let out a breath. Maybe I had just seen something messed up, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out more. And then I saw it. In the distance, another truck. Same model, same rusted, beat-up look. Same kind of man standing beside it. My stomach turned to stone. I hit the brakes hard, my car skidding slightly as I did. My hands were clammy. My mouth was dry. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else. The man ahead of me was standing just like the last one. Same torn clothes, same messy hair. His face looked different, but the rest of him looked the same. His shirt was stained with blood, just like the other man's. I didn't even slow down this time. I swerved, nearly losing control for a second, and sped past him. As I did, I caught a glimpse of his face. Blank, almost rehearsed. He didn't even look scared, he looked expectant. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just kept going. The road stretched on, and my gas light flickered on. I kept checking my mirrors. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement behind me, but I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. I had no idea where I was anymore. The road didn't have any signs, and I hadn't seen an exit in miles. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another truck. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. This one was different. This time, the truck was parked across the road, blocking the entire thing. And there were men standing beside it. 4 of them. They were waiting for me. I hit the brakes, my car skidding to a stop just before the truck. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. The men didn't move at first. They just stood there watching me. Their clothes were dirty, just like the other ones. Their shirts were stained with blood. I had 2 choices, go back or try to go around them. I didn't get a chance to decide. One of the men stepped forward, and that's when I saw what was in his hand. A knife. My body moved before my mind did. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed up fast. The men started moving toward me. Fast. Too fast. My car jolted as I hit something. My heart stopped. I looked in the mirror. Another truck. And more men. They had boxed me in. My hands were shaking. My breath was coming in short, fast gasps. This wasn't just some unlucky coincidence. This was planned. One of the men started walking toward my car, his hand resting on the handle of the driver's side door. I locked it. His face didn't change. He just tilted his head slightly, like he had been expecting that. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing. I needed to do something, anything, before it was too late. I gripped the wheel, my entire body tense. Then, without hesitating, I floored it. The car shot forward, straight toward the truck blocking the road. The men dove out of the way, but I didn't care. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. My car hit the back end of the truck, metal screeching against metal, but I kept going. The impact rattled my bones, sent a jolt of pain through my chest, but I didn't stop. Somehow, my car pushed through the gap between the truck and the trees on the side of the road. The branches scraped against my windows, but I didn't care. I kept going. I drove like my life depended on it, because it did. I didn't look back. I didn't check my mirrors. I just kept driving. It was another hour before I saw lights in the distance. A gas station. I pulled in, shaking so hard I could barely put the car in park. My hands were white-knuckled around the wheel. My breath was ragged. I sat there for a long time. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they wanted. But I knew one thing. They had been expecting me.